The note wasn't anything special. It was scribbled on a scrap of paper, the kind you'd tear from the edge of a grocery list. But the words written on it, the words I stumbled across that Tuesday morning, stopped me in my tracks. Thanks for last night. Can't stop thinking about you. It was tucked into her coat pocket, crumpled like it wasn't meant to be found. I'd been grabbing her coat to hang it up after she'd tossed it carelessly onto the kitchen chair the night before. Lauren always said she was too tired to hang her things up properly after a long day at work. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the note, my mind running in circles. The handwriting wasn't hers, but it was unmistakably intimate. Lauren and I had been married for 10 years, and I convinced myself we were solid. Not perfect, no marriage ever is, but good enough. We had a routine, a rhythm. I worked as a contractor, building houses and fixing things, while she managed a local boutique. She loved her job, always talking about the fascinating clients she worked with. But lately there had been signs. Little things I couldn't quite put my finger on, like the late nights at inventory check, or the sudden new outfits that didn't seem practical for work. And now this note. It felt like a thread hanging loose on a sweater. I knew if I pulled it, everything might unravel. That evening, I asked her about her day. She sat across from me at the dinner table, scrolling through her phone with one hand while absent-mindedly poking at her salad with the other. Busy, she said. A lot of new stock to organize. Her voice was too casual, too rehearsed. I could feel my chest tighten. I wanted to bring up the note, to slam it down on the table and demand an explanation. But something stopped me. If she was lying, I needed more than a piece of paper. I needed the whole story. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention to her. Her phone was practically glued to her hand now, and she started locking it, something she'd never bothered to do before. She left the house earlier, came home later, always with an excuse ready. A difficult client, a coworker who needed help, another shipment to unpack. And then there were the little changes. She started wearing perfume again, the kind she hadn't touched in years. Her gym membership, once an afterthought, suddenly became a regular part of her schedule. The whisper in the back of my mind was getting louder. I decided to test her. One morning, as she was rushing out the door, I asked if she wanted to grab lunch together. I told her I'd be near her boutique for a job and thought it'd be nice to meet up. She froze for a moment, her expression flickering before she forced a smile. That sounds great, she said. But today's packed. Maybe next week? I nodded, pretending to buy it. But the way her hand tightened on her purse told me everything I needed to know. That night, after she went to bed, I retrieved the note from its hiding spot in my desk drawer. I smoothed out the crumpled paper, reading the words again and again. Thanks for last night. Can't stop thinking about you. Whoever had written it was bold, careless even, and now I had a name, Derek. The handwriting was messy, but it was legible enough to piece together. I stared at the name until it was etched into my mind. Lauren had made a mistake leaving that note behind. Now I was going to find out everything. Derek. The name swirled in my head like a bad melody I couldn't escape. I didn't know who he was, but I knew what he meant. Lauren had been careless, leaving behind that note like a breadcrumb leading straight to her lies. She probably thought I'd never look in her coat pocket, that I'd never think to question her sudden late nights or her new obsession with how she looked. But now I had a name, and that was enough to start. The first thing I did was check her phone. It was risky. I'd never been the type to invade her privacy, but the thought of doing nothing made my stomach churn. She always left it charging on the counter when she showered, and I took my chance one morning. The lock screen taunted me, but I noticed something else. A notification, half hidden by the lock. A message from someone saved as Simply D. It read, "Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again." My chest tightened as I stared at the screen. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to confirm my suspicions. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, I started paying closer attention. Lauren's movements, once predictable, now felt rehearsed. She had excuses for everything. The late-night trips to the store, the sudden gym memberships, even the days she claimed she was staying late at work. But her stories didn't add up. I asked her about her co-workers one evening, playing dumb. She rattled off a few names, none of which were Derek. When I asked if there were any new hires, she shook her head too quickly. "No," she said. "Same team as always." Her answer was too smooth, too rehearsed. The next day, I took a detour on my way home from work. Lauren had mentioned stopping by the boutique to help set up a new display. I parked a block away and waited, watching the store from my truck. It didn't take long. Around 6 p.m., Lauren walked out, laughing as she locked the door behind her. But she wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, tall and broad-shouldered, his arm brushing hers as they walked to a sleek black car. He opened the passenger door for her, his smile easy and familiar. "Derek." I snapped a photo with my phone, my hands shaking. When Lauren came home that night, she was all smiles. I asked how work went, keeping my tone casual. "Busy," she said, kicking off her shoes. "But we got a lot done." She didn't even flinch. I nodded, pretending to believe her, but inside, I was seething. She didn't know I'd seen her. That weekend, I started digging deeper. I bought a GPS tracker online, the kind that synced to your phone and could be attached discreetly to a car. It arrived 2 days later, and I waited until Lauren was in the shower to slip it under her rear bumper. The app was simple, showing me her movements in real time. The first night, she told me she was meeting a friend for dinner. The tracker told me otherwise. Her car parked outside a hotel downtown, the kind with tinted windows and valet parking. She stayed for 2 hours before heading home. That night, as she climbed into bed beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She'd smiled at me when she came home, kissed me on the cheek like nothing was wrong. But I could still smell the faint traces of cologne that didn't belong to me. Lauren thought she was clever, thought she could juggle her lies without me noticing. But she was wrong. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was fact. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. If Lauren wanted to play games, I was going to beat her at them. Piece by piece, I was going to dismantle her lies, her excuses, her carefully constructed facade. She wouldn't see it coming. Lauren's lies were unraveling faster than I could have imagined. The GPS tracker revealed a routine as predictable as clockwork. Tuesday and Thursday nights at the same hotel, occasional lunches at an out-of-the-way cafe, and even a late-night stop at a secluded park. She thought she was clever, but every move she made added another piece to the puzzle. I wasn't just watching anymore. I was documenting. The first time I followed her, my heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. She told me she was meeting her co-worker, Stephanie, for drinks. The tracker showed her car parked outside the boutique hotel downtown. I waited across the street, watching through the windshield of my truck as she stepped out of her car in a black dress I didn't recognize. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she walked toward the entrance where Derek was waiting. He smiled, leaning in for a kiss, and she melted into him like they'd done this 100 times before. I took a photo, the shutter sound on my phone muted, my hand steady despite the storm in my chest. That night, I retrieved the hidden voice recorder I'd slipped into her car days earlier. The playback was a mess of muffled sounds and static, but there were moments of clarity. Derek's voice, smooth and confident. "You look stunning today. I couldn't stop staring at you in that dress." Lauren's laugh, light and flirtatious. "You're bad for me. You know that?" His reply cut through the static like a knife. "You love it." I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around the recorder. This wasn't just an affair. This was a performance, a show they both thought they could keep hidden. The second time I followed her, she didn't go to the hotel. The tracker led me to a quiet restaurant on the outskirts of town, the kind with dim lighting and overpriced wine. I parked a block away, slipping inside unnoticed. They were at a table in the back, their heads close as they laughed over a shared bottle of wine. Derek's hand rested on her knee under the table, his thumb tracing lazy circles. I ordered a drink at the bar, keeping my back to them but angling my phone just enough to snap a photo of their reflections in the mirrored wall. Lauren's smile was radiant, her laugh carefree. It was a version of her I hadn't seen in years. By the end of the week, I had enough evidence to fill a folder. GPS logs, photos, voice recordings, even receipts I'd found crumpled in her purse. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed to break her carefully constructed world piece by piece, to let her feel the weight of her choices in a way she couldn't ignore. The first step was her job. Lauren loved the boutique, loved the way it gave her a sense of control and authority. But she'd also used it as an excuse for her late nights and weekend inventory checks. Using an anonymous email account, I sent a message to her boss. Lauren, last name, has been engaging in unprofessional behavior, meeting a man named Derek. Last name, during work hours. Please see attached photos and GPS logs for proof. The response came faster than I expected. By the next day, Lauren came home fuming. "They're reviewing my performance," she said, slamming her bag onto the counter. "Someone sent them photos, fake photos, claiming I've been slacking off." I feigned concern, my heart racing beneath a calm exterior. "That's ridiculous," I said. "Do you know who might have done it?" Her eyes darted away, her hands tightening into fists. "No," she muttered. "Good, I thought. Let her stew." The second step was her social circle. Lauren prided herself on her friendships, cultivating a group of women who admired her perfect life. I knew they'd never look at her the same once they saw the truth. Using the burner phone, I sent a message to her best friend, Amanda. "I thought you should know who Lauren really is." Attached are photos and messages proving her affair. "You deserve to know the truth." Lauren came home that evening with her phone in hand, her expression a mix of anger and fear. "Amanda isn't answering my calls," she said, pacing the living room. She thinks I've done something terrible." I shrugged, keeping my face neutral. "Maybe she's just busy." Lauren shot me a glare, her frustration bubbling to the surface. But she didn't have an answer. Piece by piece, her world was starting to crumble, and she still didn't know I was the one pulling the strings. Lauren's world was beginning to unravel, though she hadn't fully realized it yet. Every move she made, every excuse she gave, only pushed her closer to the edge. Her job was hanging by a thread. Her friendships were fraying. And yet, she carried herself with the arrogance of someone who believed she was untouchable. I watched it all unfold in silence, waiting for the right moment to tighten the noose. The fallout at work escalated quickly. Lauren came home one evening, slamming the door behind her. She paced the kitchen, her phone clutched tightly in her hand as she muttered under her breath. I asked her what was wrong, feigning concern. "They're auditing my work," she snapped, her voice sharp. "Emails, schedules, everything. They said there's been a complaint." Her words dripped with disdain, as if the idea of anyone questioning her professionalism was absurd. "Do they think you've done something wrong?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She glared at me, her eyes narrowing. "Of course not. It's just office politics. Someone's jealous, probably trying to make me look bad." I nodded, hiding my satisfaction. Let her think it was politics. Let her scramble to hold on to the one thing she thought she controlled. Her friends were next. Katie, her closest confidant, had stopped responding to her calls and texts. When Lauren cornered her at a coffee shop, I was parked across the street, watching through the wide windows. Lauren leaned across the table, her gestures animated, her expression a mix of desperation and anger. Katie sat stiffly, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. At one point, Katie slid her phone across the table, showing Lauren something that made her recoil. I didn't need to guess what it was. Lauren stormed out minutes later, her face pale, her movements stiff. She didn't talk about it when she came home. The tracker on her car continued to provide damning evidence. On one of her supposed inventory nights, she went to a different location, a private house on the outskirts of town. The driveway was long and hidden from the road, but I parked far enough away to watch through binoculars. Derek was waiting for her. He opened the door with a smile, pulling her into an embrace before leading her inside. I waited for hours, my anger simmering beneath the surface. When she finally left, her car headlights cutting through the darkness, I took another photo of her as she pulled onto the road. Her lies were becoming routine, and routine was easy to predict. The final straw came when I decided to contact Derek directly. Using the burner phone, I sent him a text. "I know what you're doing. Stay away from her, or everyone finds out." His response was immediate. "Who is this? How do you know Lauren?" I didn't reply, but I knew the message would plant a seed of doubt, a crack in their relationship that would only grow. Lauren came home later than usual that night, her face tense, her phone clutched like a lifeline. She barely said a word to me, disappearing into the bedroom without so much as a good night. I checked the hidden camera I'd placed in the living room, reviewing the footage later. She'd spent nearly an hour on the phone with Derek, her voice muffled but panicked. "Someone knows," she'd said. "I don't know who, but they're watching us." Derek's response was too quiet to hear, but it didn't matter. The doubt was there. The cracks were widening. By the end of the week, Lauren was a shell of the confident woman she'd once been. Her phone buzzed constantly, her once perfect posture slumping under the weight of her secrets. She was losing control, and she knew it, but she didn't know who was behind it. Not yet. Lauren was unraveling faster than I anticipated. Her once confident demeanor had crumbled into a frantic, paranoid mess. The lies she used to weave so seamlessly were starting to tangle, and she couldn't keep her story straight anymore. Every step she took, every excuse she made, brought her closer to the edge, and I was still tightening the noose. Her job was slipping through her fingers. She came home one night after another meeting with HR, her face pale, her hands trembling as she set her bag on the counter. "They're asking for my emails," she said, her voice breaking. "All of them. They're saying I might have violated policy." She poured herself a glass of wine, downing it in one gulp before pouring another. I leaned against the doorway, watching her carefully. "Do you think someone's out to get you?" I asked. She froze for a moment, her back to me, before turning around. "I don't know," she said, her voice sharp. "It doesn't make sense. Someone's sending them fake photos, fake messages." She cut herself off, her eyes darting away. I wanted to laugh at the irony. Nothing about the photos or messages was fake. She was simply being forced to confront the reality she'd spent so long avoiding. Derek was pulling away from her, too. The tracker showed her car at his house less frequently, and the voice recorder caught snippets of tense conversations between them. "We need to cool this off," Derek said in one recording. His tone was firm, no trace of the smooth charm he'd once used to seduce her. "You're scared," Lauren shot back, her voice rising. "You're letting whoever this is win." "It's not about them," he replied. "It's about protecting myself. You should do the same." The words were a dagger to her ego, and I could hear the panic in her reply. "Derek, don't do this. You know I." Her voice trailed off, the vulnerability I hadn't heard in years slipping through. I replayed the recording later, my anger mingled with a grim satisfaction. She was losing her grip on him, just as she'd lost her grip on everything else. The burner phone gave me another opportunity to push her further. I sent an anonymous text to her, the words carefully chosen. "I know everything. The hotel. Derek. The lies. You can't hide forever." She read the message in the kitchen, her face draining of color. "Floyd," she called out, her voice trembling. I stepped into the room, keeping my expression neutral. "What's up?" She hesitated, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "Nothing," she said finally. "It's nothing." But her hands were shaking, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. That night, she didn't sleep. I watched her toss and turn, her phone lighting up intermittently as she checked it, expecting another message. She didn't know the threat was coming from inside her own home. Her friends were gone, her reputation at work was in tatters, and Derek was slipping through her fingers. She was running out of places to turn, and the pressure was taking its toll. I started noticing little things. Her makeup smudged from hurried application, her once perfect outfits wrinkled and mismatched, her tone sharp and defensive at every question. But she still hadn't figured it out. She didn't know I was behind it all. The trap was nearly set. All I needed now was the perfect moment to spring it. Lauren's life was collapsing piece by piece, and she was scrambling to hold it together. Her paranoia had reached a boiling point. She jumped every time her phone buzzed, glanced nervously at the windows, and avoided answering direct questions. Her world was cracking under the weight of her lies, and I was about to shatter it completely. It started with the photos. I printed them all. Her and Derek at the hotel, in the cafe, and outside his house. I included the screenshots of their text messages, the GPS logs showing her trips, and a transcript of their recorded conversations. I compiled everything into a neat folder and slipped it into an envelope. On the front, I wrote 2 words, the truth. That evening, while she was out running errands, I left it on the kitchen counter where she couldn't miss it. When she came home, I was sitting in the living room, pretending to watch TV. I heard her set down her keys, the soft shuffle of her feet as she moved through the house. Then silence. She found the envelope. Minutes passed before she entered the living room, the folder clutched in her trembling hands. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and fury. You knew, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I muted the TV and turned to her, keeping my expression cold. For a long time, she shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Why didn't you say anything? Why would you do this? I stood, walking toward her slowly. Why? I echoed, my voice sharp. Because you didn't just betray me, Lauren. You lied over and over and thought you could get away with it. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand to stop her. You blamed me, I said, my voice rising. Every time I asked about your late nights, every time I tried to reach out, you turned it back on me. Said I didn't care enough, didn't try hard enough. And all the while, you were sneaking around behind my back. Her sobs grew louder, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. It wasn't like that, Floyd. I didn't mean for it to happen. I was lonely, and you. Don't you dare blame me for this. I snapped, cutting her off. She dropped the folder onto the coffee table, her shoulders slumping as she sank onto the couch. What now? She asked, her voice barely audible. I sat across from her, meeting her tearful gaze with an icy stare. Now, you face the consequences. The next morning, I met with Clara, my lawyer, to finalize the divorce papers. She flipped through the file of evidence I'd provided, nodding approvingly. This is airtight, she said. With this, you'll walk away with everything. House, savings, even the car. She won't have a leg to stand on. Good, I replied, my voice firm. It wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure Lauren couldn't manipulate her way out of what she'd done. When I handed her the divorce papers that evening, she stared at them like they were a death sentence. You can't be serious, she said, her voice trembling. I'm dead serious, I replied. You don't get to ruin my life and walk away unscathed. She looked at me, her tears falling freely now. Floyd, please. Don't do this. We can fix this. I'll change. You already changed, I said coldly. You just didn't bother to tell me. By the end of the week, Lauren had packed her things. She didn't fight the divorce, didn't argue over the settlement. The evidence was too damning, and she knew it. When she stood at the door with her suitcases, she turned to me one last time. I'm sorry, she whispered. I nodded, my face unreadable. Goodbye, Lauren. She hesitated, as if expecting me to stop her, but I didn't. The door closed behind her, and for the first time in months, the house was quiet. Peaceful. The trap had sprung, and Lauren's life had crumbled. And now I could finally move on. After Lauren left, the house felt different. Not empty, exactly, but hollow. The tension that had lived in every corner, every room, was gone. In its place was an unfamiliar silence, one that felt more like a clean slate than a void. The first morning after she was gone, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the spot where she used to sit. The divorce papers were finalized, the evidence had done its job, and I was free. But freedom has a strange way of feeling heavy. Word about Lauren's affair had spread quickly, thanks to the whispers of her former friends and the fallout at work. She'd been let go from the boutique, and the last I heard, she was living in a tiny apartment on the other side of town. I wasn't gloating. Knowing she was struggling didn't bring me any joy. It just brought a sense of finality. She'd built her life on lies, and now she was living in the ruins. One afternoon, as I worked on a project in the garage, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Amanda, one of Lauren's former friends. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, she wrote, for not seeing it sooner. You didn't deserve any of this. I stared at the message for a long moment before typing a quick response. Thanks. It means a lot. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me that not everyone had turned a blind eye. I started focusing on the things I'd neglected during my marriage. I spent more time with my tools, taking on side projects that I'd put off for years. I reconnected with old friends, meeting for beers and laughing about stories from a time when life felt simpler. I even started running again, something I hadn't done since Lauren had mocked me for being too busy to stick to it. It was liberating to take back pieces of myself I'd lost along the way. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. "Floyd, it's me," the message read. "I just need to talk. Please. Lauren." I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. There was nothing left to say. Days turned into weeks, and the silence in the house no longer felt oppressive. It felt peaceful. I rearranged the furniture, painted the walls, and got rid of the last remnants of her influence. It wasn't just a house anymore, it was my house. One morning, as I jogged through the park, I ran into an old acquaintance, Jess. She was a friend of a friend, someone I hadn't seen in years. We struck up a conversation, laughing about how much had changed and how little had stayed the same. By the time I headed home, she'd asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. "Why not?" I'd said. Lauren's chapter in my life was closed. The pain, the betrayal, the anger, it had all served its purpose, pushing me to rediscover who I was without her. And as I stood in my quiet kitchen that evening, sipping a glass of bourbon, I realized something. The best revenge wasn't what I'd done to Lauren. It was what I'd done for myself. Lauren's absence in my life didn't leave a hole. It left space. Space to breathe, to think, to figure out who I was without the constant weight of her deceit pressing down on me. The days following her departure were strange but freeing. The house was quiet. The routines I'd once resented now felt like opportunities for something better. I didn't feel lost without her. I felt found. Jess and I had coffee the following weekend, sitting outside at a quiet cafe that had become my go-to spot. She was easy to talk to, her humor quick and disarming, and there wasn't a hint of the pretense I'd grown so used to with Lauren. We talked about everything: work, hobbies, the little things that made up our lives. Not once did the conversation feel forced. When she smiled at me, it was genuine. No games, no hidden meanings. It was a refreshing change, and I found myself smiling back. The house became my sanctuary. I spent weekends working on projects I'd always meant to get around to. I built a new bookshelf for the living room, replaced the fence in the backyard, and even started a small garden, something I'd never considered before. Every improvement felt like a step forward, a declaration that this space was mine now. Lauren had made her mark on the house, but I was erasing it, piece by piece. She tried to contact me again. A message popped up late one night as I was reading. "I just want to talk, Floyd. Please. I miss you." I stared at the words, feeling nothing. The anger, the sadness, the betrayal, it was all gone. I deleted the message without responding. Lauren wasn't part of my story anymore. Jess and I started seeing more of each other. It was casual at first: coffee, walks in the park, the occasional dinner. But over time it became something more. She never pried into my past, never asked for details about what had happened with Lauren. Instead, she focused on the present, on who I was now. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, she turned to me, her eyes thoughtful. "You seem lighter," she said, "like you've left something behind." I nodded, smiling faintly. "I have." The new business venture I'd started was thriving. I poured my energy into it, building relationships with clients and taking pride in the work I was doing. It wasn't just about making a living anymore. It was about creating something meaningful. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my own life. Lauren's name stopped coming up in conversations, even with mutual acquaintances. She'd faded into the background, her life reduced to whispers I didn't bother to listen to. The last I heard, she'd moved again, chasing another fresh start. But it wasn't my concern anymore. One afternoon, as Jess and I hiked a familiar trail, she paused to look out over the valley below. "It's funny," she said, her voice soft, "how sometimes the hardest things we go through end up giving us exactly what we need." I looked at her, the warmth of her presence filling the space that had once been so empty. "Yeah," I said, my voice steady. "Funny how that works." Lauren's betrayal had been a turning point, a painful, bitter moment that forced me to rebuild from the ground up. And now, standing on the other side of it, I realized something. I wasn't defined by what she'd done to me. I was defined by how I'd moved forward. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt unshakably mine. Each day felt like a small victory, a steady reclamation of everything I'd lost during my marriage to Lauren. The memories of her betrayal no longer stung. They were just echoes, faint and distant. Jess had become an unexpected constant. She was patient, kind, and refreshingly genuine. She didn't press about my past, didn't try to fix me, and let our relationship unfold naturally. It wasn't about filling the void Lauren had left. It was about building something new. One evening, while Jess and I were cooking dinner together, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was another message from Lauren. "Floyd, I just need to see you one last time. Please." I stared at the screen, the words feeling hollow and meaningless. Jess glanced at me, her brow furrowed. "Everything okay?" I nodded, sliding the phone onto the counter. "Yeah, just someone I don't need to respond to." She didn't press, and I appreciated her for it. The message stayed unread. Another ghost from a life I no longer belonged to. The business Jess and I had started together was thriving. She had a natural talent for design, and my skills in construction complemented her vision perfectly. We worked seamlessly together, creating spaces for clients that reflected their dreams. It wasn't just work, it was something I was proud of, something I could pour myself into without reservation. Lauren's constant critiques and dismissive attitude during our marriage had once made me doubt my abilities. Now, standing on a job site with Jess by my side, I knew those doubts belonged to the past. One day, as we finished a renovation project for a young couple, Jess leaned against the freshly painted wall, smiling at me. "Do you ever feel like everything led you here?" she asked. I paused, considering her words. "I do," I said finally. "Even the things that felt like they'd break me, they were just clearing the way for this." She nodded, her eyes soft. "Funny how life works, isn't it?" I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd lost during my time with Lauren. The years of walking on eggshells, of shrinking to fit her needs, of sacrificing pieces of myself to keep the peace. It had taken a toll I hadn't fully understood until now. With Jess, it was different. She didn't demand or expect anything beyond honesty. She encouraged me to be myself, flaws and all, and I found a strength in that I hadn't known I had. Lauren made one final attempt to contact me. It was a letter delivered by mail, handwritten and filled with apologies and regrets. She wrote about how much she missed the life we'd had, how she realized too late what she'd lost, how she wanted a chance to make amends. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the trash without finishing it. Not out of anger, out of peace. Lauren's time in my life was over. That weekend, Jess and I hiked to a scenic overlook I hadn't visited in years. The view stretched for miles, the golden light of the setting sun bathing the valley below. As we stood there, her hand slipped into mine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for her, but for the journey that had brought me to this moment. "Do you ever regret any of it?" she asked, her voice quiet. I shook my head, squeezing her hand gently. "Not anymore," I said. The past had been painful, but it had shaped me in ways I couldn't ignore. It had forced me to grow, to rediscover who I was, and to rebuild my life from the ground up. And as I stood there, with Jess beside me and the world stretching out before us, I realized one thing. The best parts of my life were still ahead of me. The past has a way of lingering, even when you think it's gone. Lauren's betrayal had once felt like a wound too deep to heal, a shadow too dark to escape. But as time passed, it became clear that the wound wasn't permanent, and the shadow had only made me stronger. Lauren's final letter sat unread in the trash, her name fading into a memory I no longer cared to revisit. She wasn't part of my life anymore, and I wasn't tethered to hers. The life I'd built with Jess, the business we were growing, the quiet evenings we spent together, it was all a testament to the fact that moving forward was possible. One evening, Jess and I sat on the porch, sipping wine as the sun dipped below the horizon. She looked over at me, her eyes reflecting the fading light. "Do you think you'd ever talk to her again?" I didn't need to ask who she meant. I thought about it for a moment, the idea settling in my mind like a stone in still water. "I don't think there's anything left to say," I replied. She's a part of my past. That's where she belongs. Jess nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. You've come a long way, Floyd. I hope you know that. I smiled back, grateful for her steady presence, for the quiet strength she'd helped me find in myself. Months later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Lauren had moved out of town. She'd taken a job at a small retail store, far from the life she'd once built. It didn't spark anger or pity, just a quiet sense of closure. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. Jess and I continued to grow our business, taking on larger projects and building a reputation in the community. It wasn't just a career, it was a partnership, a shared dream that reflected the life we were building together. Every challenge we faced, every success we celebrated, reminded me how far I'd come from the man who once stood in the wreckage of his marriage, wondering how to pick up the pieces. One day, as we walked through a newly completed home, Jess turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You're happy, aren't you?" she asked. I paused, taking in the freshly painted walls, the sunlight streaming through the windows, the warmth of her hand in mine. "Yeah," I said. "I really am." The past hadn't defined me. It had shaped me, pushed me to become someone stronger, someone who could stand tall even after being knocked down. Lauren's chapter was closed, and the story that followed was entirely mine. And as I stood there, with Jess by my side and the future stretching out before us, I knew one thing for certain. I was exactly where I was meant to be. So, what do you think about my story? Drop a comment with your thoughts on my decision and how you would have handled it.